There is a building on the edge of Yale University that has no windows. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. It sits on the corner of High Street and Wall Street in New Haven, Connecticut. The stone is dark brownish gray, the color of old ash. The walls are thick and blank and smooth. No glass, no openings, just stone rising up from the sidewalk like something that grew there instead of being built. People walk past it every day. Students with backpacks, professors with coffee, tourists with cameras pointed at the prettier buildings nearby. Most of them glance at it once and keep moving. A few stop and stare, and a small number of people, the ones who know what it is, look away a little too quickly. This building has a name. People call it the Tomb. New Haven is a city that knows how to hold a secret. It sits on the Connecticut coast, tucked between the Quinnipiac River and the Long Island Sound, where the salt air rolls in off the water and settles over everything like a thin gray blanket. The streets are old and narrow in places. The trees along the main avenues are enormous, their roots lifting the sidewalk slabs into gentle waves. In the fall, the whole city turns amber and rust and deep red, and the light comes in low and golden through the leaves. Yale sits at the center of it all. The university is beautiful in the way that old, powerful things are beautiful. Gothic stone buildings with iron gates, courtyards full of ivy, libraries with ceilings so high you have to tilt your head back to see them. The whole campus feels like it was designed to make you feel small in a pleasant way. Like history is watching you and finding you acceptable. But the tomb is different. It was built in 1856. That makes it older than the Civil War, older than the telephone, older than the light bulb. The men who built it were young college students, barely out of their teenage years, and yet they built something that has lasted nearly 2 centuries without anyone on the outside knowing exactly what happens inside. The organization that built it is called Skull and Bones. You may have heard that name before. It tends to surface in conversations about power, about presidents, about the kind of men who seem to end up running things no matter which party wins. The name floats up in whispers and then disappears again, like smoke in a breeze. Here is what most people agree on. Skull and Bones is a secret society at Yale University. Every year, 15 junior students are chosen to join. The selection happens in the spring in a ritual called Tap Day. A senior member finds you, taps you on the shoulder, and just like that, your life changes. The members are called Bonesmen. Once you are in for life. You meet in the tomb. You share secrets. And when you leave Yale and go out into the world, you carry something with you that nobody on the outside fully understands. Over the years, the names of the members have leaked out. Some were published against the society's wishes. Some members admitted their membership openly. And when you look at that list, really look at it, something strange begins to take shape. Presidents, senators, cabinet members, CIA directors, ambassadors, bankers, newspaper publishers, men who shaped wars, men who signed treaties, men who decided in quiet rooms what the rest of the country would know and what it would not. William Howard Taft, Prescott Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, John Kerry. The list goes on, and it reaches into almost every corner of American power for the last 150 years. Now, none of that is secret. Those names are public record. The society exists. The building is real. You can walk up to it right now and put your hand on the stone. What nobody can fully explain is the why of it. Why do so many Bonesmen end up in the same rooms making the same decisions? Why do they hire each other? Why do they protect each other? Why, in 2004, did two men from the same tiny secret society at the same university end up as the only two choices for the most powerful office in the world? The tomb sits on its corner in New Haven. The stone is cold. The walls have no windows. And somewhere behind that locked door, a story is waiting. New Haven, Connecticut. Picture it in 1856. The city sits at the edge of Long Island Sound, where the salt air rolls in off the water and mixes with the smell of coal smoke and fresh-cut timber. The streets are dirt and cobblestone. The buildings buildings are brick and wood, most of them dark with soot from 1,000 chimneys. Gas lamps line the main roads, throwing small orange circles of light onto the mud below. Beyond those circles, the night is very dark. Yale College is already old by this point. It has been here since 1701. The campus spreads out in long green quadrangles, bordered by elm trees so tall and thick they form a kind of ceiling over the walkways. In autumn, those elms go gold and copper, and the light that filters through them turns everything the color of old honey. In winter, the branches are bare and black against a white sky, and the wind off the sound cuts right through your coat. The students who walked those paths in 1856, dressed in long wool coats and tall hats. They carried leather satchels. They wrote by candlelight and oil lamp. They heated their rooms with small iron stoves that glowed red in the dark and smelled of burning wood and ash. The world moved slowly then. A letter took days to arrive. News traveled by horse and by rail. Most of what happened in one place stayed in that place. This is the world the tomb was built into. The building went up at the corner of High Street and Wall Street, right at the edge of the Yale campus. It was completed in 1856, and from the first day it stood there, it was strange. Not strange the way a haunted house is strange. Strange the way a sealed vault is strange. Strange because of what it refused to show you. The tomb is made of brownstone. That warm, dark, reddish-brown stone that was fashionable in the mid-1800s. The same stone you see in old New York townhouses and Boston churches. Up close, the surface is rough and grainy, almost like dried mud that has been pressed and hardened over centuries. The color shifts depending on the light. In morning sun, it looks almost orange. In overcast weather, it goes the color of dried blood. At night, it disappears into the dark almost completely. The building is 2 stories tall and wide. It has the look of a Greek temple crossed with a mausoleum. The front face is flat and severe, with a heavy stone portico and thick columns that frame the entrance. The proportions are deliberate. Everything about the design says permanence, says weight, says we are not going anywhere. And then there are the windows. Or rather, there aren't. The tomb has no windows on its exterior walls. None. A building that size in a city in the middle of a university campus, and not a single pane of glass faces the street. The walls are solid stone from the ground to the roofline. Whatever light exists inside that building, it comes from somewhere you cannot see. Whatever happens inside those walls, no one passing on the sidewalk has ever caught a glimpse of it. Think about what that means in practical terms. In 1856, you had no electricity. You had candles and oil lamps and gas fixtures. A building with no windows is a building that chose darkness over daylight, chose privacy over air. The men who designed it made a specific decision. They said, the outside world does not need to see in here. And then they built 4 solid walls of stone to make sure of it. The door is iron, heavy and black, set deep into the stone frame. There is a skull carved above it, not hidden, not subtle. Right there above the entrance, in plain sight, for anyone walking by to see. A skull and crossbones cut into the brownstone, looking down at the street. New Haven grew up around the tomb. The city changed. The gas lamps became electric lights. The dirt streets became pavement. The elm trees mostly died in the 1950s, taken by disease, and the campus lost that golden canopy. Buildings rose and fell and rose again. But the tomb stayed exactly as it was. Same stone, same iron door, same skull above the entrance, same sealed walls. Students walked past it every day for 150 years. Most of them never went inside. Most of them never would. The building sat on its corner and watched the city change around it, patient as a stone, quiet as a sealed room. The air in New Haven in autumn smells like wet leaves and cold water, and something faintly metallic from the sound. Stand outside the tomb on an October evening, and you can smell all of it. The door does not open for you. But once, a long time ago, it opened for 15 of them. The year was 1832. Yale was a different place then. The campus was smaller, quieter, hemmed in by elm trees so tall and thick they turned the afternoon light green. Students wore dark coats and carried leather satchels. They walked in groups across the yard, their breath clouding in the cold New England air. They were young men from old families, mostly, sons of merchants and ministers and lawyers, boys who had grown up knowing that certain doors would open for them and certain doors would not. William Huntington Russell was one of them. He was tall and serious, with the kind of face that looks older than it is. He carried himself like a man who had already decided something important and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. He had spent time in Germany the year before, studying at a university in Berlin, and he came back changed. He came back with ideas. He came back with a model. In Germany, he had seen how certain men organized themselves, not just as friends or classmates, but as something tighter, a brotherhood with rituals and ranks, and a shared sense of purpose that lasted long after the school years ended. He watched how those men moved through the world after graduation, how they found each other in government offices and counting houses and law firms, how they remembered each other, how they helped each other. Russell came back to New Haven with all of that sitting in his chest like a warm coal. Alphonso Taft was another one of the 15. He was a quieter man than Russell, rounder in the face, with steady brown eyes and a careful way of speaking. He came from Vermont, from a family that believed in hard work and public service in equal measure. He would go on to become a judge, then a cabinet secretary, then an ambassador. His son would become president. But in 1832, he was just a young man in a dark coat, walking across the Yale yard, listening to William Russell talk about what they could build together. The other 13 have names that echo through American history like footsteps in an empty hall. Scudder, Trowbridge, Phelps, Bacon, Butler, names that showed up later on courthouses and bank buildings, and the mastheads of newspapers. Names carved into the stone of American institutions, the way initials get carved into old wood. These 15 men were not unusual in their ambitions. Every young man at Yale in 1832 had ambitions. What made them different was that they decided to share those ambitions with each other in a formal way, to bind themselves together with something more than friendship, something with weight to it, something that would last called their new society the Brotherhood of Death at first. That name did not stick. What stuck was simpler. The skull and crossbones, the number 322, the name that came later, the one carved above the door. Picture them in a room together that first year. Candlelight, probably. The smell of tallow and old wood, and the faint cold draft that comes through every old New England building in November. 15 young men sitting in a circle, speaking in low voices, deciding what they owed each other, deciding what the rules would be, deciding who they were. They were serious about it. That is the thing people forget when they hear this story. They were not playing. They were not putting on costumes for a lark. They were building something they intended to last. You can feel that intention in the way the organization took shape, careful and deliberate, with rituals borrowed from older traditions and symbols chosen for their weight. Russell was the engine of it. Taft was the anchor. The others filled in the spaces between, each one bringing something the group needed. A sharp legal mind here, a family fortune there, a connection to a senator, a judge, a shipping company, a newspaper. 15 men, one room, one autumn. By the time they graduated, the thing they had built had a shape to it. It had a name. It had rules. It had a list of members and a plan for how new members would be chosen each year. 15 new men every spring, tapped on the shoulder and brought inside. The tomb would not be built for another 20 years. But the society that would fill it was already alive, already breathing, already reaching forward into the future with both hands. The elm trees stood over the Yale yard that winter, bare and black against a gray sky. The cold came in off the sound. 15 young men walked out of whatever room they had been meeting in and went back to their ordinary lives. Nothing looked different, but something had changed. And what did those ordinary lives look like exactly? Picture Yale in the early 1830s. The campus was small then. A handful of brick buildings arranged around a long green yard. Elm trees everywhere, planted in rows, their branches meeting overhead like the arched ceiling of a church. In summer, the light came through them in pieces, green and gold, dappling the paths where students walked between classes. In those same trees went bare, and the wind came straight off Long Island Sound with nothing to stop it. It was cold in a way that settled into your coat and stayed there. The students wore dark wool. They carried books under their arms. They walked in pairs and small groups, talking about their lessons, their professors, their families back home. Most of them came from money. Not all of them, but most. Yale in those years was not a place for ordinary boys. It was a place for the sons of merchants and lawyers and ministers. Young men who had grown up with libraries in their houses and tutors at their kitchen tables. Their days had a steady rhythm to them. Morning chapel first, before the sun was fully up. The pews were cold wood and the prayers were long. Then classes, one after another, in subjects like Greek and Latin, and moral philosophy and rhetoric. The professors were serious men who believed that learning was a kind of duty. The students sat in rows and took notes with quill pens and tried to stay awake. Meals were eaten together in a common hall. The food was plain: bread and salt pork and boiled things. The smell of wood smoke was always in the air. After dinner, the students had a few hours to themselves, and that was when the real life of the campus happened. They gathered in each other's rooms. They argued about ideas. They formed clubs and debate societies and literary groups. This was what Yale men did. They organized. They built small worlds inside the larger one. There were already secret societies at Yale before Skull and Bones existed. Phi Beta Kappa had been there since the 1780s. Other groups had come and gone. The idea of a society, a brotherhood with its own rituals and its own private language, was not new. It was part of the culture of the place. Young men who were far from home and surrounded by other young men with sharp minds and large ambitions. They wanted to belong to something. They wanted to feel chosen. What Russell and his group built in 1832 was different, though. Or at least, that is how the story has always been told. The other societies were open in certain ways. They had public faces. Skull and Bones, from the very beginning, had none. It turned its back to the world and kept its curtains drawn. But in those early years, before the tomb was built, before the name was fully settled, before the rituals had hardened into tradition, the whole thing was still soft and new. The 15 men who started it were still students. They still had to wake up for morning chapel. They still had to sit through lectures on Greek verbs. They still ate the same plain food in the same cold hall as everyone else. From the outside, nothing marked them as different. They walked the same paths. They wore the same dark wool. A stranger watching them cross the yard would have seen nothing unusual. Just young men going about their days, shoulders hunched against the wind, breath fogging in the cold air. But when they were together, in whatever room they had claimed as their own, something else was happening. They were practicing, learning how to be a group, learning the particular art of shared secrecy, which is different from ordinary friendship. Ordinary friendship is open. It spills out into the world. Shared secrecy pulls inward. It creates a wall between the people inside and everyone else. And once you have built that wall, even a small one, even a new one, you start to see the world differently. There is inside and there is outside. There is us and there is them. These were boys who would grow into men who ran banks and sat in courtrooms and wrote laws and sent ships across the ocean. They were practicing for that too, in their way. Learning how power moves quietly, how it speaks in low voices in small rooms, how it does not announce itself. The elm trees stood bare over the yard. The cold settled in, and 15 young men went about their ordinary days, carrying something invisible between them, something that had no name yet, but was already taking shape. It started with bones, not a metaphor, not a symbol drawn on paper or carved into wood. Actual bones, a human skull and a set of crossed femurs, sitting on a table in a room where they had no business being. The year was somewhere in the early 1830s. The exact date has blurred over time, the way dates do when a story passes through enough hands. But the bones themselves, those stayed sharp in the telling, because bones are hard to forget. They have a weight to them, even in memory. They carry a kind of gravity that softer things don't. The story goes like this. A student at Yale came across them. He was not part of the group. He was just a young man walking where young men walked, in the cold gray light of a New Haven morning when he saw something through a doorway or a window or a gap in a curtain. The exact detail shifts depending on who's telling it. What he saw stopped him cold. A skull on a table. 2 long bones crossed beneath it, and no one around to explain why they were there. He told someone. That someone told someone else. And the story moved through the college, the way stories always move through small, closed places, fast and quiet, like smoke under a door. Now, here is what's interesting. Nobody came forward to explain the bones. No professor. No administrator. No member of the group that had been forming in the shadows of the campus. The bones simply appeared in the story and then disappeared from the record. No one claimed them. No one denied them. They were just there, and then the silence closed over them like water over a stone. You might think that's strange. You might expect someone to say, "Oh, those were from a medical study," or "those were borrowed from the natural philosophy department," or some other plain and ordinary explanation. But no explanation came. The bones sat in the story, unexplained, and the silence around them said more than any explanation could have. There is a particular kind of silence that is not empty. It is full, packed tight with things that are not being said. The silence that followed the bones was that kind. It had shape and weight. It pressed against the edges of the story and held everything in. The group that would become Skull and Bones had been using symbols for a while by then. Symbols are useful when you want to say something without saying it out loud. They let you communicate across a room full of strangers. They let you mark a door or a book or a letter in a way that only certain eyes will understand. A skull and crossbones was not a new symbol in the 1830s. Sailors had used it. Pirates had flown it on flags that snapped in the salt wind over dark water. Apothecaries had painted it on bottles of poison to warn away the careless. It was a symbol that meant danger or death or keep out, depending on who was reading it. But in this context, in this story, it meant something else. Or maybe it meant all of those things at once. The bones showed up again in later years, not always physically, sometimes just as a rumor, a whisper that certain members of the group unusual lengths to acquire human remains, that the skull on the table inside the building they would eventually call the tomb had a history attached to it. A name, even. Some versions of the story say it was the skull of a Mexican general. Some say it was something older. Some say it was Geronimo, the great Apache leader, and that his skull was taken from his grave at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and brought north to New Haven by men who wore the bones as their badge. That last claim has never been proven. The Apache people have asked for the return of Geronimo's remains. The society has said nothing useful in response. The silence, again, doing its particular kind of work. What you are left with is a feeling, not a fact exactly. A feeling that something was present in that room that should not have been there. That the bones were not decoration. That they were not a joke or a prank or a prop borrowed from a stage. They were chosen, placed deliberately. They meant something to the people who put them there, and that meaning has never fully come to light. The elm trees outside the building were bare that winter. The cold came in off the harbor, and somewhere inside a locked room, the bones sat on a table in the dark, waiting for someone to ask the right question. No one did. The people of New Haven talked, of course. They always talked. Small cities have long memories, and New Haven was no different. The locals had watched that stone building go up on High Street. They had watched the deliveries arrive at odd hours. They had watched young men in good coats walk through that door and never once look back at the street behind them. Word moved the way word always moves in a place like that. Slowly at first, then all at once. The barbers knew things. The men who delivered coal knew things. The women who took in laundry from the dormitories knew things, too, though nobody thought to ask them until much later. What they all knew, in their separate and partial ways, was this: something was happening on that hill that was not quite like anything else happening in New Haven. There was a woman named Edith, or so the story goes. She ran a boarding house 2 streets over from the Yale campus in the 1870s. She fed students and professors and the occasional traveling merchant. She kept a clean table and a warm kitchen, and she listened the way quiet people do, which is to say, she listened to everything. She told her daughter, and her daughter told her own children, that the boys who belonged to that society came back changed after their first Thursday night inside. Not frightened, not troubled, something else. Settled, she called it, like a man who has made a decision he will never have to revisit. Her daughter remembered the word she used. Settled, like a stone dropped into still water that has finally reached the bottom. The tavern talk was rougher. Men who worked the docks and the rail yards had less patience for mystery. They called the society a club for boys who had too much money and not enough sense. They said the rituals were theater. They said the whole thing was a game. Rich families played to make their sons feel important before handing them the family business anyway. But even those men went quiet when someone brought up the bones, because the bones were not theater. The bones were real. And everyone in New Haven, at some level, knew it. There was a particular story that circulated through the churches on Sunday mornings, passed in low voices between the pews. A groundskeeper at the university had seen something he could not explain. He had been working near the building late one evening, raking leaves from the path that ran along its iron fence. The windows were dark, as they always were, but he heard something from inside. Not voices exactly, something more like a rhythm. A low, steady sound, like men speaking in unison, all at the same pace, all on the same breath. He told his pastor. His pastor told the congregation. The congregation told everyone else. By the time the story had made its third or fourth pass through New Haven, the sound had become a chant, and the chant had become something older and stranger, and the building itself had taken on a quality in the local imagination that no amount of daylight could quite wash away. People began to cross the street when they walked past it, not because they were afraid exactly, because it felt like the right thing to do, like giving a sleeping animal its space. The old-timers had a phrase for what the society was doing. They called it learning to keep a room. It meant something specific to them. It meant knowing how to hold a space, how to fill it with the right kind of silence, how to make everyone outside that space feel the weight of what they were not allowed to know. Rich boys, they said, learned to keep a room before they learned anything else. And the tomb on High Street was the finest room any of them would ever keep. What the locals understood in their bones, if not in their words, was that the secrecy was not accidental. It was not a byproduct of the rituals. It was the point. The silence was the lesson. A boy who could keep that particular secret in that particular building, surrounded by that particular company, had proven something about himself that no diploma could prove. He had proven he could be trusted with something larger than himself, and the men who ran the society, the men who had built it and shaped it and passed it down like a piece of good furniture, they knew exactly what they were building. They were not building a club. They were building a habit, a way of moving through the world, a way of standing in a room full of powerful people and knowing, without saying a word, that you all belong to the same quiet thing. But habits do not appear from nothing. They come from somewhere. They have roots that go down deeper than the men who practice them. And if you want to understand what Skull and Bones became, you have to go back further than 1832. You have to go back to the ground itself. The land beneath Yale is old, older than the university, older than the colony. The Quinnipiac people lived along that stretch of Connecticut coast for thousands of years before any English ship came around the bend. They knew the rivers. They knew the tidal marshes where the salt grass bent in the wind like something breathing. They knew the low hills and the dark soil and the particular way fog settled over the harbor on autumn mornings, thick and white and still as sleep. The Quinnipiac had their own ways of marking who belonged to what, their own ceremonies, their own moments when a young person crossed from one kind of life into another. Those rituals were private too, not secret out of shame. Secret because some things only work when they are held apart from ordinary days. Sacred and secret are often the same word wearing different clothes. The English settlers arrived in 1638. They called the place New Haven. They were Puritans, and they brought with them a deep belief that certain knowledge was not meant for everyone. Their churches had inner circles. Their communities had hierarchies. The idea that some men were chosen and others were not was not a new idea to them. It was the oldest idea they had. By the time Yale College opened its doors in 1701, that belief had been baked into the very structure of the place. Yale was not built to educate everyone. It was built to educate a particular kind of young man, a man who would go on to lead, a man who would carry the values of a certain class, a certain faith, a certain vision of what America should be, out into the world and into the rooms where decisions were made. The initiation into skull and bones, when it finally came, did not invent that idea. It inherited it. What we know about the initiation itself is partial. Fragments, pieces passed down through whispers, and the occasional slip of a tongue loosened by age or wine, or the strange urge that comes over old men to finally say the thing they have kept quiet for 50 years. There is a room inside the tomb that members call the inner temple. The walls are said to be hung with portraits of men long dead. Men who ran banks and governments and wars. Men whose names appear in history books, and men whose names do not. The room is lit by candles, or was in the early years, and the light they throw is the kind of light that makes everything look like a painting. Warm and amber and slightly unreal. A new initiate, called a knight in the society's own language, is brought into that room in darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, actual darkness. He cannot see where he is going. He is guided by hands he cannot identify. The floor beneath his feet changes texture as he moves, from stone to wood to something softer, and the air changes too, growing warmer, carrying the faint smell of old paper and candle smoke, and something else, something harder to name, like the inside of a very old church. What happens next is the part nobody has ever fully described. Not because nothing happens, but because the men who went through it came out the other side changed in some way they could not put into plain words. They came out knowing something, not a fact, not a secret in the way a password is a secret, something more like a feeling, a sense of weight, of continuity, of being one small link in a chain that stretched back further than they could see. Some who have spoken about it in vague terms say there is a moment when the initiate is asked to lie down. In a coffin, some say. Others say it is simply the floor. The symbolism is the same either way. You go down as one thing, you come up as another. Death and rebirth, the oldest ritual shape in the world. That shape is not unique to skull and bones. You find it in the mystery schools of ancient Greece. You find it in the rites of Freemasonry. You find it in the ceremonies of the Quinnipiac. In the long fasting vigils, young men undertook alone in the dark before they were considered ready to carry the weight of the tribe. The form is ancient. The tomb on High Street simply gave it a new address. There have always been people who could not leave it alone, not because they were angry, not because they had something to prove, just because a locked door, when you stare at it long enough, starts to feel like a question. And some people are built in such a way that questions like that will not let them sleep. One of those people was a journalist named Ron Rosenbaum. He was young in 1977, working for a small magazine called New Times, and he had heard enough about skull and bones to want to see it for himself. Not the building, not the plaque on the door, the inside, the Thursday nights, the rituals that had been whispered about for nearly 150 years without a single confirmed account. He went to New Haven. He walked up High Street. He stood across from the tomb in the thin October light and looked at it the way you look at something that does not want to be looked at. The building stared back. It always does. Rosenbaum was patient. He talked to locals. He talked to Yale students who had friends who had friends who knew someone. He sat in diners and coffee shops and let people talk around the edges of the thing, the way people do when they know something but are not sure they should say it. He collected fragments, impressions, half sentences that trailed off into silence. What he found was not a smoking gun. It was something quieter than that, a shape in the fog. From the pieces he gathered, and from accounts that have surfaced in the decades since, a rough picture of those Thursday nights has come together. Not a clear picture, more like a photograph left too long in the light, where the outlines are visible, but the details have burned away. The members gather after dark. That much is consistent across every account. There is something about the nighttime that the society has always preferred. The tomb at night looks different than it does in the afternoon sun. The stone goes darker. The iron fence catches no light. The building seems to pull the shadows toward it like a man pulling a coat closed against the cold. Inside, the rooms are said to be warm. Heavy curtains, dark wood, the smell of old paper and candle wax, and something underneath that, something older, like a church that has been a church for a very long time. Portraits on the walls. Men in formal dress looking out from heavy frames, their eyes flat and patient and certain. The members eat together. That is one of the oldest parts of the ritual. A shared meal, bread and salt and something to drink. The table is long. The candles are real. No electric light, some say, on the nights that matter. After the meal, there is confession. That word has been used by more than one person who has tried to describe what happens. Not religious confession, something more like testimony. Each member speaks. They talk about their lives, their fears, their ambitions, the things they have done that they are not proud of. They say these things out loud in the candlelight to the other 14 men in the room. Think about what that does to a group of people. You have just arrived at one of the most powerful universities in the country. You are 18 or 19 years old. You are already being watched, already being measured. And now you are sitting in a room with 14 other young men who will one day run banks and newspapers and governments. And you are telling them the truth about yourself. All of it. The soft parts. The parts you hide. And they are doing the same. That is not just a ritual. That is a bond. That is the kind of knowledge that ties people together for life. Because now you know something about each other that the rest of the world does not know. And they know it about you. The secret is not a document or a password. The secret is each other. Rosenbaum wrote about this. He called it a kind of psychological glue. He was not wrong. He also noted carefully that he could not verify most of what he had been told. The people who knew would not say. The people who said did not know. That gap, the space between what is rumored and what is confirmed, is exactly where Skull and Bones has always lived. It is comfortable there. It has had 150 years to make itself at home in the dark. The tomb kept its silence. It always has. But the people who came out of it, those people went on to do things that left marks on the world. And those marks are a little easier to read. The first one to reach the White House was not who most people expect. His name was William Howard Taft. He was tapped into Skull and Bones in 1878. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a wide face and a careful way of speaking. He graduated from Yale and then from Cincinnati Law School. He became a judge, then a governor general, then Secretary of War. Then, in 1909, he walked through the doors of the White House as the 27th President of the United States. But before all of that, he sat in the tomb on High Street. He learned the handshake. He told his secrets to 14 other young men in the candlelight. He became a Bonesman. His father, Alphonso Taft, had helped found the society back in 1832. So for William, this was not just an initiation. It was a homecoming. He was walking into something his own family had built. The stone walls of that tomb had his family's fingerprints on them, going back 2 generations. People who knew Taft in those early years said he was changed by it, not broken or hollowed out. Changed the way a piece of iron changes when it gets put in a fire and then pulled back out. Still itself, but harder, more certain of its shape. One of his classmates, a man named Clarence Edwards, kept a diary during those years at Yale. The diary survived. Parts of it were shared with researchers decades later. Edwards wrote about Taft with a kind of quiet awe. He said Taft moved through rooms differently after their senior year, like he knew something, like he had been told something that settled him down deep. Edwards wrote, and these are close to his words, he seemed to know where he was going before he had any reason to know it. The rest of us were still guessing at our lives. Taft was not guessing. That is a small thing. One man's impression of another, but it sits in the mind and does not leave easily. There is a woman named Helen Herron who became Taft's wife. She wrote letters throughout their long marriage. In one letter, written sometime in the 1890s, she mentioned a dinner they attended with several of his old Yale friends. She wrote that the men spoke to each other in a way she could not quite follow. Not in code, not in whispers, but there was was a shorthand between them. She said, a way of finishing each other's thoughts. That made her feel like she was watching a conversation that had started long before she arrived and would continue long after she left. She was not suspicious of it. She was not afraid. She was simply noting what she saw. These men knew each other in a way that went deeper than ordinary friendship. She had seen close friends before. This was something else. Taft himself almost never spoke about Skull and Bones directly. That was the rule, and he kept it. But there is one moment, recorded in a letter to his brother Horace, where he came close. He was writing about loyalty, about what it meant to trust someone completely. He wrote that there were men in his life he would never have to explain himself to, men who already understood. He did not say where those men came from. He did not have to. Horace Taft was also a Bonesman. He understood the letter perfectly. What you are left with when you read through these accounts is not a picture of conspiracy. It is something quieter than that. It is a picture of men who were knitted together before the world had a chance to pull them apart, who went out into law firms and courtrooms and cabinet rooms and foreign offices, carrying the same invisible thread between them. William Howard Taft became president. He later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only man in American history to hold both offices. He sat at the top of two branches of government, one after the other. And through all of it, the men he trusted most, the ones he called on, the ones who appeared again and again in his letters and his decisions, were men who had sat in the same candlelit room with him in New Haven. That is not proof of anything. People will tell you that, and they are right in the narrow sense. But proof is not the only thing that matters when you are trying to understand how power works. Sometimes the most important thing is simply noticing who keeps showing up in the same room. There is a pattern to how power moves. It does not announce itself. It does not march down the street with a brass band. It moves the way water moves through old stone, quietly, steadily, finding the cracks that were already there and widening them just a little over a very long time. You start to see it when you lay the names out side by side. Alphonso Taft was a Bonesman. he became Secretary of War under President Grant. Then he became Attorney General. His son, William Howard Taft, was a Bonesman. He became President, then Chief Justice. Henry Stimson was a Bonesman. He served as Secretary of War under not one president, but two. He was there during the First World War. He was there during the Second. He helped shape the decisions that moved armies across entire continents. These are not small positions. These are the rooms where the largest decisions in American life get made. And the same kinds of names keep appearing in those rooms, decade after decade, the way certain wildflowers keep blooming in the same field, no matter how many times the season turns. Here is what makes the pattern strange. It is not that these men were simply successful. Yale produced many successful men. So did Harvard and Princeton and a dozen other schools. But the Bonesmen did not just succeed. They succeeded in a particular way. They moved toward the center of things, toward the rooms where the real decisions lived. And they moved there together, or they moved there separately, and then found each other waiting. George Bundy was a Bonesman. He became National Security Advisor to President Kennedy, then to President Johnson. He sat in the room during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He sat in the room during the early years of Vietnam. His brother William Bundy was also a Bonesman. William became an Assistant Secretary of State. The two brothers, shaped by the same secret society, shaped by the same Thursday nights in the same stone building on the same hill in New Haven, ended up advising two different presidents on some of the most dangerous decisions of the 20th century. You can call that coincidence. Some people do. But coincidence usually runs out after a while. It tends to thin out over time, the way fog burns off in the morning sun. This particular coincidence did not thin out. It kept going. It kept producing the same kinds of results in the same kinds of places. Think about what a network really is. Not the word, but the thing itself. It is a set of relationships built before the need for them arrives. It is trust that was earned in a small room, in the dark, under conditions that most people never experience. When you have been through something like that with another person, something private and strange and binding, you carry a different kind of feeling toward them. Not just friendship, something older than friendship, something closer to loyalty in the bone. And loyalty in the bone does not ask for proof. It does not require a memo or a formal request. It operates on instinct, on the quiet knowledge that this person, this particular person, is one of yours. So, when a Bonesman became a cabinet secretary and needed a deputy, he did not have to think very hard about who to trust. The list was already written. It had been written years before, in a building with no windows, by 15 young men who had no idea yet what they were going to become. That is how the pattern works. It is not a conspiracy in the way movies show conspiracies. There are no maps on the wall with red string connecting photographs. There are no coded messages. There is just a group of men who trust each other more than they trust anyone else, who hire each other, who recommend each other, who call each other when the hard decisions come. And because they are always moving toward the center of power, the center of power begins to look like them. The rooms change. The names on the doors change. The decades change. But if you stand back far enough and look at the whole picture, something holds still inside it, a shape that keeps repeating, a set of connections that keeps producing the same result. Power moving from room to room, quietly, without announcement, carried by men who learned a long time ago in a candlelit building on a hill in Connecticut that the most important thing you can have in this world is not money or talent or even ambition. It is the right people standing beside you when the moment comes. Now think about what a cabinet seat actually is. It is not a title. It is not a trophy on a shelf. It is a chair at the table where the country gets decided. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Treasury. These are the rooms where the real work happens, where the maps get drawn and the money gets moved and the orders get written. And for a very long time, if you looked carefully at who was sitting in those chairs, you kept seeing the same kind of man, same schools, same clubs, same handshake. The names are worth saying slowly. Henry Stimson graduated Yale in 1888. He was a Bonesman. He served as Secretary of War under William Howard Taft. Then he served again as Secretary of War under Franklin Roosevelt. 2 different presidents, 2 different wars, 1 man in the chair both times. Stimson was not loud about his connections. He did not need to be. The connections spoke for themselves. Robert Lovett came next. He was tapped for Skull and Bones in 1918. He went on to become Secretary of Defense under Harry Truman. He also served as Under Secretary of State. Lovett was the kind of man other powerful men called before they made a decision. Not after, before. His name appeared in the right places so often that historians started calling him a permanent fixture of the American foreign policy world. He was not elected to anything. He was simply always there. George Bundy, Bonesman, National Security Advisor to both John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. He helped shape the early decisions of the Vietnam War. He sat in the room when the big choices were made. He was not a senator. He was not a general. He was a man with the right education and the right connections and the right name. And those 3 things were enough. This is what the pattern looks like up close. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It looks like a list of resumes. It looks like a series of appointments. It looks like the normal movement of qualified men through important positions. And maybe that is exactly what it is. That is the honest thing to say. Maybe these men were simply the best prepared, the best connected, the most trusted, and that is why they kept appearing. But here is the thing that makes people stop and look twice. The number of Americans who have attended Yale is small. The number who joined Skull and Bones is smaller still. 15 men per year. That is the rule. 15 men chosen from the whole of Yale's senior class. In any given decade, that is maybe 150 men total. Out of a country of hundreds of millions of people. And yet, when you look at the cabinet seats, the advisory roles, the intelligence positions, the diplomatic postings, the names of the men who shaped American foreign policy across the 20th century, that tiny group keeps appearing at a rate that does not match their numbers. Statisticians have a word for when something happens more often than chance would predict. They call it significant. The cabinet appointments of Skull and Bones members across the 20th century are by that measure, significant. Think about the Treasury. Think about state. Think about defense. Think about the CIA, which was built in large part by men who came out of Yale's secret societies. Think about the law firms that advised the government, the banks that financed the wars, the newspapers that shaped the stories people told themselves about those wars. In each of those places, in each of those decades, you find the same small network of men who knew each other before they were powerful, men who had sat in the same candlelit room and said the same words and shared the same strange rituals. They did not need to conspire. That is the quiet heart of this whole story. They did not need to meet in secret and divide up the country on a map. They simply trusted each other. They simply called each other. They simply said, "When a seat opened up, I know a man." And the man they knew had gone to the same school, joined the same club, learned the same lessons about loyalty and silence and the weight of belonging to something larger than yourself. The seats kept filling. The decades kept turning. The names on the doors kept changing, but the shape underneath stayed the same. A small group of men, a long chain of trust, a set of rooms that kept welcoming the same kind of face, not by accident, not by design, by something quieter than either of those words, by habit, by gravity, by the simple fact that power, once it finds a home, tends to stay there. William Howard Taft was a large man, not just in body, though he was certainly that. He was large in the way that certain people seem to take up more space than their physical form allows. He had a broad, open face, a thick mustache that sat on his upper lip like a sleeping animal, and eyes that always seemed to be watching something just past the edge of the room. He was born in Cincinnati in 1857. His father, Alphonso Taft, had helped found Skull and Bones, had sat in that same stone building on High Street, had learned the same words, held the same rituals, carried the same silence home with him. So when William Howard Taft walked through the door of the tomb as a young Yale student in 1878, he was not a stranger to what waited inside. He was, in a way, coming home. He was tapped. He was initiated. He became a Bonesman. And then something strange began to happen. Not that's strange in the way of ghosts or lights in the sky. Strange in the way of a clock that keeps perfect time even after you remove the battery. Strange in the way of a man who seems to know which door to open before anyone tells him it exists. Taft graduated Yale. He studied law. He built a career in Ohio courts, steady and deliberate, like a river that knows exactly where it is going. By 1890, he was Solicitor General of the United States. By 1892, he sat on the federal bench. Each step came at the right moment. Each door opened just as he reached for it. Then Theodore Roosevelt appointed him Secretary of War in 1904. Here is where the detail lives. Here is the thing that sits in the back of the story and refuses to move. While Taft was Secretary of War, he began making trips. Quiet trips, diplomatic missions to the Philippines, to Cuba, to Panama. He was managing American interests abroad, which was part of his job. But people who studied his correspondence later noticed something. Taft seemed to know, before official policy was announced, what that policy would be. He wrote letters that anticipated decisions. He made arrangements for outcomes that had not yet been decided in any public forum. He was not guessing. His predictions were too precise for guessing. Some historians called it good political instincts. Some called it access to Roosevelt's inner circle. Both of those things were true, but there was a third thing, quieter than either of those explanations. Taft was writing to men he had known since Yale. Men who sat in agencies and offices and boardrooms. Men who had gone through the same initiation in the same stone building, and who understood, without being told, what loyalty meant. He did not need official briefings. He had a network that moved faster than official channels. By 1908, Roosevelt had decided not to seek another term. He wanted Taft to succeed him. He said so publicly. He campaigned for Taft. He pushed the Republican Party toward Taft with the full weight of his considerable personality. And Taft won. He became the 27th President of the United States. But here is the detail that people keep returning to. In 1906, 2 years before the election, Taft wrote a letter to a close friend. The letter discussed the burdens of the presidency, the weight of the office, the specific challenges a man in that position would face in the coming decade. He wrote about it the way a man writes about a job he already has, not a job he is hoping for, not a position he is working toward, a role he is already inhabiting in his mind, already measuring himself against, already preparing for in the most specific and practical terms. 2 years before he was elected, 2 years before the outcome was certain to anyone watching from the outside. Maybe it was confidence. Maybe it was ambition. Maybe it was simply a man who knew his own path well enough to walk it in the dark. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the particular kind of certainty that comes from belonging to a group that has been placing its members in positions of power for decades. Maybe it was the quiet knowledge that the men who would shape the next election were men he had known since he was 21 years old. Men who had stood in the same candle-lit room and made the same promises. Maybe William Howard Taft knew he would be president the same way you know the sun will rise. Not because someone told him, because the world he lived in had been arranged slowly and carefully to make it so. Now, not everyone sees it that way. There are careful, serious people who have looked at all of this and said, slow down. They are not fools. They are not paid to say it. They are historians and journalists and professors who have spent years studying power in America. And their argument is worth hearing because it is not a weak one. They say this: when you look at a group of men who all went to the same elite university, who all came from wealthy families, who all moved in the same social circles, it should not surprise you that they ended up in similar places. Power attracts power. Money opens doors. Yale was already producing senators and cabinet members and presidents long before Skull and Bones existed. The society, they say, is a symptom, not a cause. It is what happens when privilege concentrates in one place and calls itself a tradition. That is a fair point. It deserves to sit with you for a moment. They also say this: the men who belonged to Skull and Bones did not always agree with each other. They did not vote as a bloc. They did not share a single political vision. Some were Democrats. Some were Republicans. Some pushed the country toward war. Others spent their careers trying to prevent it. If there was a unified agenda, it was a remarkably inconsistent one. The society, the skeptics argue, is more like an old boys' network than a shadow government. A place where connections are made, not orders given. And again, that is not nothing. That is a real argument. But then you get to the war contracts. And this is where the skeptics tend to go a little quiet. During World War II, the United States government spent more money than it had ever spent in its history. Billions of dollars moved from Washington into the hands of private companies. Steel companies, shipping companies, arms manufacturers, chemical companies. The men who ran those companies got very rich, and a striking number of those men had a very specific thing in common. They had been tapped on the shoulder at Yale. Prescott Bush, father of one president and grandfather of another, was a Bonesman. He was also a banker whose firm had financial ties to companies that were doing business in Germany well into the early years of the war. The details of those arrangements have been argued over for decades. The documents are real. The connections are real. What they mean is the part people disagree about. W. Averill Harriman was a Bonesman. He ran the Union Pacific Railroad. He ran a bank. He served in multiple presidential administrations across multiple decades. He was one of the most connected men in American life for nearly half a century. When money needed to move and decisions needed to be made, Harriman was often in the room. Henry Stimson was a Bonesman. He served as Secretary of War under two different presidents from two different parties. He was the man who oversaw the Manhattan Project. He was one of the men who helped decide to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. His name is in the history books. His society membership is usually in the footnotes, if it appears at all. The skeptics look at these names and say, of course, powerful men knew each other. Of course, they went to the same schools. That is how America worked in the 20th century. That is how it still works. There is nothing secret about it. And they are right that it is not secret. The names are there. The records exist. Nobody is hiding the fact that these men knew each other. What the skeptics cannot quite explain is the consistency. The way the same institution keeps producing the same kind of man in the same kind of role at the same kind of moment. Not once, not twice, but across generations, across wars, across the full sweep of American history, from the Civil War to the Cold War to the wars that came after. A coincidence can explain one name, maybe two. A network can explain a handful. But at some point, the pattern stops looking like an accident and starts looking like a design. The skeptics are not wrong to be skeptical. Skepticism is healthy. It keeps stories honest. But even the most careful skeptic, when they sit down and trace the lines from one Bonesman to the next, from one war contract to the next, from one cabinet seat to the next, tends to pause, tends to look at the page a little longer than they planned to, tends to find themselves asking a question they did not expect to ask. Not whether the society had power, but how much. George Herbert Walker Bush was born into it. Not just the wealth, though there was plenty of that. Not just the name, though the name carried weight in certain rooms. He was born into a world where skull and bones was simply part of what happened next. You grew up. You went to Andover. You went to Yale. And if the right men decided you were ready, someone came and found you. His father was Prescott Bush, senator from Connecticut, Yale man, Bonesman, class of 1917. Prescott Bush was the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice. Tall, steady, the sort of person other powerful men listened to without quite knowing why. He had been tapped on the shoulder himself decades before his son was born. And when his son grew up and walked the same paths through the same stone courtyards, the pattern held. George Herbert Walker Bush was tapped in 1947. He was 23 years old, a war hero already. He had flown 58 combat missions in the Pacific. His plane had been shot down over the Bonen Islands, and he had floated in the ocean for 4 hours before a submarine pulled him out. He came back from that war with something quiet behind his eyes, a steadiness that men who had not seen combat sometimes found hard to read. And then Skull and Bones found him. The people who believe in the society's power point to Bush as their clearest example. Not because of what he said. Bush was famously careful with words. He once told a reporter that Skull and Bones was so secret he couldn't say anything about it. He smiled when he said it, a small, practiced smile, the kind that closes a door politely without slamming it. But the believers point to what he did. After Yale, Bush moved to Texas. He built a career in oil. He ran for Senate and lost. He ran again and lost again. And then something shifted. Doors opened. Appointments came. He became the United States ambassador to the United Nations in 1971. Then chairman of the Republican National Committee. Then chief of the United States Liaison Office in China. Then director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Each post was handed to him by someone else. Each one placed him closer to the center of American power. The believers look at that list, and they see a man being moved across a board. Carefully, deliberately, like a piece that someone with a long view had decided to position just so. There is a woman named Alexandra Robbins who spent years researching the society. She talked to members. She talked to people who knew members. She talked to people who had watched from the outside for decades. Her book came out in 2002, and it was not a wild-eyed screed. It was careful. It was sourced. And the people she quoted, the ones who spoke on record, had a particular quality to them. They were not angry. They were not frightened. They were calm in the way that people are calm when they have decided that the truth is more important than what people think of them. One former member told her that the bonds formed inside the tomb were unlike anything else in American life. That the rituals, whatever they were, created a loyalty that lasted longer than marriages and deeper than friendship. That when a Bonesman needed something, he called another Bonesman, and the call was answered. Not always, not perfectly, but more often than chance could explain. That is what the believers hold onto, not the conspiracy posters, not the shadowy diagrams with red string connecting faces. Just that simple, stubborn fact. The calls get answered. The doors open. The appointments come through. Bush became vice president in 1981 under Ronald Reagan, who was not a Bonesman. And then in 1989, he became the 41st President of the United States. His son, George W. Bush was tapped into Skull and Bones in 1968. His son became the 43rd president. 2 generations, 1 family, 1 tomb on 1 hill in New Haven, Connecticut. The believers do not need you to share their certainty. They have been living with this knowledge long enough that your doubt does not shake them. They have traced the lines. They have read the names. They have watched the same families circle back through the same rooms across the same long decades. They are not angry about it. That is the thing that surprises people. They are almost peaceful, like someone who has solved a puzzle and set it down and no longer needs to explain it to anyone. They know what they know, and they are content to let the rest of the world catch up. There is a year that sits differently than the others. A year that the land around New Haven seems to hold in its soil like a stone holds heat long after the sun has gone down. That year is 2004. In 2004, 2 men ran against each other for the presidency of the United States. One was the sitting president. One was a senator from Massachusetts. Both had gone to Yale. Both had been tapped on the shoulder in the dark. Both had lain in a velvet-lined coffin and spoken their names into the stone ceiling of the same windowless tomb on the same hill. George W. Bush and John Kerry. Skull and Bones, class of 1968. Skull and Bones, class of 1966. 2 Bonesmen, 1 election, 1 office. Think about what that means for a moment, not as a theory, just as a fact. The 2 men competing for the most powerful seat in the world had both passed through the same initiation, had both sworn the same oaths, had both eaten at the same long table and slept under the same roof, and called each other by the same strange nicknames that only members ever know. The American people were given a choice that year, and both choices led back to the same room. The elm trees along the streets of New Haven are old. Some of them were saplings when the tomb was first built. They have grown tall and crooked, the way old trees do, leaning slightly away from the building on High Street, as if they learned long ago to give it space. Locals notice things like that. The way certain trees grow away from certain places. The way certain patches of ground stay soft even in dry summers. The way certain corners of a city feel heavier than others, like the air there has more weight to it. New Haven is a city built on layers. There are streets under streets. There are foundations under foundations. The oldest parts of the city remember things the newer parts have forgotten. And in 2004, when the news anchors stood in front of their maps and talked about swing states and polling numbers, the old parts of New Haven stayed quiet. The elm trees leaned. The ground held its moisture. The tomb on the hill sat exactly as it always had, dark and sealed and patient. The Quinnipiac River runs through that part of Connecticut. It is a slow river, brown and wide in places, narrow and quick in others. The Quinnipiac people lived along its banks for thousands of years before anyone built a university or a secret society or a city. The river does not care about elections. It runs the same direction it always has. But there is something about moving water that makes people want to say things out loud, confess things. The river hears everything and carries it away. People who grew up near New Haven will tell you that the city has a particular smell in autumn. Wet leaves and old stone, and something faintly metallic, like the air before a storm. That smell was in the air in November of 2004, when the votes were counted and George W. Bush won his second term. John Kerry conceded the next morning. 2 Bonesmen, 1 winner, 1 loser. And somewhere in that exchange, in that phone call between 2 men who had shared the same initiation decades before, there must have been something that ordinary people will never quite understand. A shorthand, a shared language, a knowledge of the same rooms and the same rituals and the same long history that stretched back behind both of them like a shadow. Animals avoid certain meadows. That is a thing farmers and hunters have always known. A dog will stop at the edge of a field and refuse to go further. A deer will change its path for no visible reason. There is no explaining it, not really. The land holds something. The land remembers. And the hill in New Haven, the one with the stone building and the locked iron door, and the no windows facing the street, that hill has been holding something for a very long time now. 2 men who came from that hill stood before the entire country in 2004 and asked to be trusted with everything. And the country chose between them, and the country moved on. The news cycle turned. The maps were folded up. The anchors went home. But the elm trees on High Street kept leaning. The river kept running. The autumn smell of wet leaves and old stone settled back over the city like a quilt. And the tomb sat exactly where it had always sat, waiting the way old things wait, without hurry, without worry, knowing that time is on its side. Kerry sat down for a television interview in the summer of 2004. The host asked him about skull and bones. It was a simple question. Millions of people were watching. Kerry smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows what he is going to say and has known it for a long time. He said it was a secret. He said he couldn't talk about it. And then he moved on, smooth as river water over a flat stone. That was it. That was the whole answer. Now, a politician dodging a question is not exactly rare. That happens every single day in this country. But there is something worth sitting with here. The man was running for the highest office in the land. He was asking every American to trust him with their lives, their children's lives, the direction of the whole country. And when asked about a group he had belonged to since college, a group that had shaped nearly every friendship and connection and open door he had ever walked through, he smiled and said he couldn't talk about it. And nobody pushed very hard. That is the part that stays with you if you let it. This kind of thing has a long pattern in America. It is not just New Haven. It is not just one tomb on one hill in one Connecticut city. Secret societies have grown up in this country like wildflowers in a field, quiet and persistent. And everywhere once you start to look. The Freemasons built their lodges in nearly every town with more than a few hundred people. The Odd Fellows put their symbols above doorways in places you would never expect. The elks, the moose, the eagles, the Shriners with their little cars and their red hats. America has always loved a secret room, but most of those groups were open about their existence. They had signs on their buildings. They held public events. They let the town know they were there, even if they kept the inside rituals private. Skull and Bones was different from the beginning. It did not want to be seen. It wanted to be felt, the way a cold draft through a wall is felt before the source is ever found. The pattern shows up in other places too. In the South, there were old plantation families who passed certain handshakes down through generations, the way other families passed down land or silver. In the West, railroad men and mining barons formed private clubs in cities like San Francisco and Denver. Clubs where the real decisions got made before any public meeting was ever called. The Bohemian Club up in the California redwoods has been gathering powerful men every summer for over 100 years. Presidents have gone. Generals have gone. Men who run the largest companies in the world have gone. They camp in the woods together, and they do not talk about what happens there. You can find the same shape of thing in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Chicago. The names change. The handshakes change. The buildings look different, but the structure is always the same. A small group, a shared secret, a network of trust that runs deeper than any job title or political party. And then, years later, the same names appearing again in positions of power, in boardrooms, in cabinet offices, in the quiet back rooms where the real conversations happen. Kerry knew George W. Bush from the tomb. They had both walked those same stone floors. They had both heard whatever is said in that place, seen whatever is shown, promised whatever is promised. And then they stood on opposite sides of one of the most contested elections in American history and asked the country to choose between them. Think about what that means for a moment. Not in a dark way, just as a fact. Two men from the same secret room, shaped by the same rituals, connected by the same invisible thread, competing for the same office. The country saw a choice, a clear left and right, a red and a blue, a this and a that. And underneath all of it, there was this other thing, this shared origin, this common root that neither man would discuss on television. Kerry smiled and said he couldn't talk about it. Bush had said almost the same thing a few months earlier in a different interview with a different host. Same smile, same smooth pivot, same closed door, two men, same answer, same silence. That silence has a texture to it. It feels like wool. It feels like the kind of quiet that settles over a town after a heavy snow, when everything familiar looks just slightly different, and you can't quite say why. The pattern is older than both of them, and it will outlast them too. Patterns leave marks. That is the thing about power when it moves through the same hands, generation after generation. It leaves physical traces, paper, photographs, objects, things you can hold and turn over in the light and say, yes, this was real, this happened, someone was here. Start with the families, because when you trace the names that appear inside the skull and bones membership rolls, you keep arriving at the same surnames. Not once, not twice, over and over across decades, like a river that always finds the same path down the same hill. The Taft family, the Bush family, the Whitney family, the Harriman family, the Bundy family. These names do not appear once in the history of skull and bones. They appear in clusters, father and son, uncle and nephew, cousins who attended Yale a generation apart and walked through the same stone door and sat in the same candlelit rooms and swore the same oaths. William Howard Taft was tapped in 1878. His son, Robert Taft, was tapped in 1910. Robert Taft went on to become one of the most powerful senators in American history. The family name moved through the organization like a thread through cloth, stitching one era to the next. Prescott Bush was tapped in 1917. His son, George Herbert Walker Bush, was tapped in 1948. His grandson, George W. Bush, was tapped in 1968. 3 generations, 3 men, 1 tomb, 1 set of rituals, 1 shared silence that stretched across most of the 20th century and into the 21st. You can hold that in your hand. It is not a theory. It is a list of names and dates that anyone can read. Now look at the photographs. There are not many. The society does not encourage cameras, but a few images have survived, passed quietly from hand to hand, appearing in newspaper archives and private collections, and the occasional academic study. They show groups of young men in formal dress, seated in rows, stiff and serious. The photographs are old. The paper is brown at the edges, soft as dried leaves. the backgrounds. In some of these images, you can see the interior of the tomb itself. Dark wood paneling, a long table, objects on shelves that are hard to make out, shapes that might be ceremonial, might be decorative, might be something else entirely. The light in these photographs is low and warm, like firelight, and it makes the room feel older than it is, like something from another century entirely. There are letters too. Not many have been made public, but some have surfaced over the years through estate sales and university archives. Letters written by Bonesmen to each other, decades after their initiation, that refer to the society in careful, oblique language. They do not name it directly. They use phrases like the association or our friends from the old days or the group you and I both know. The language is deliberate, chosen. These men were trained to speak around things without speaking about them. One letter, written in the 1950s by a man who had served in a senior government position, refers to a meeting with another former member as a reunion of the family, not his blood family, something else, something chosen and sworn and sealed. Then there are the objects. A few have made their way into public view over the years. A ceremonial skull, carved from what appears to be ivory, was photographed in the 1980s after a former member brought it to a journalist. The journalist described it as heavy and cold and very old, with markings on the base that he could not identify. The skull disappeared again after that. No one has seen it since. A silver plate engraved with the society's insignia, the number 322 and the crossed bones, was found in the estate of a deceased member in Connecticut in the 1970s. His family did not know what it was. They sold it at auction. The buyer was anonymous. These objects do not prove anything on their own. A skull, a plate, a few careful letters, photographs with dark backgrounds and blurry shelves. Taken separately, they are curiosities. Taken together, alongside the names and the dates and the family trees that keep circling back to the same rooms, they start to feel like something more. They feel like evidence that a world existed and still exists, just slightly out of view. A world with its own objects and its own language and its own sense of who belongs and who does not. quietly alongside the visible one for a very long time. The families kept the door open. The objects kept the memory alive. And the letters kept the language going, even when no one was supposed to be listening. Think about how a secret actually survives. Not in a vault, not in a locked room. It survives at the dinner table. It survives in the way a grandfather pauses before he answers a question. It survives in the look that passes between two people when a third person says the wrong name out loud. Secrets live in people, and people pass them down. The families connected to skull and bones have been doing this for 150 years. Longer, maybe. The names change slightly from one generation to the next. The faces in the portraits get younger, then older, then younger again. But the shape of the story stays the same. A young man goes to Yale. He is tapped in the spring of his junior year. He walks through a door, and when he comes out, he is different. Not in a way you can point to, just different. His children grow up knowing something happened. They do not know exactly what, but they feel the outline of it. The way you can feel the shape of a piece of furniture under a sheet. You cannot see it clearly, but you know it is there. You know it is solid. Some families talk about it openly in their own way. Not the details, never the details, but the fact of it, the membership, the belonging. A father might say to his son, "When the time comes, you will understand." That sentence alone carries weight. It carries the promise of a door that will open someday. It carries the suggestion that the world has rooms you have not seen yet. Other families go quieter. The grandfather who was a member dies, and the papers get sorted, and most of them get burned or boxed. A grandson finds a photograph decades later. 15 young men in dark coats, a table with objects on it, a skull maybe, candles. He does not know what he is looking at. He puts it in a drawer. He forgets about it. Then one day he reads something or hears something, and he takes the photograph out again, and he looks at his grandfather's face in the back row, and he thinks, oh, that moment happens over and over again, across families, across decades. The recognition arrives late, like a letter that got lost in the mail for 30 years, and finally shows up on a Tuesday morning. The story gets shaped by each telling. That is the nature of any story passed through time. Some details get polished smooth, worn down by repetition until they shine. Others get quietly set aside, not because they are false, but because they are inconvenient or confusing or too hard to explain to someone who was not there. What remains is the core, the essential thing, the part that will not let go. And the core of this story is simple. A group of men were bound together. They were bound by ritual and by promise, and by the shared knowledge of something they experienced together in a stone building on a Thursday night. That bond did not end at graduation. It followed them into boardrooms and courtrooms and cabinet meetings and Oval Offices. It followed them through marriages and funerals and wars. It was still there when they were old men with white hair and slow hands. It was still there at the end. The families felt that bond even when they could not name it. A phone call that came through at the right moment. A recommendation that appeared from nowhere. A door that opened without anyone knocking. These things happened. They kept happening. And the people inside those families knew, in the way you know things you have never been told directly, that the bond was the reason. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in families. It is not written down. It is not spoken in full sentences. It is passed through tone and gesture and silence. Through the way a story gets told and the way it gets stopped. Through what gets mentioned at the holiday table and what gets left out. This kind of knowledge is harder to trace than a document. It leaves no paper trail, but it is real. It shapes people. It shapes what they expect from the world and what they feel they deserve. The families connected to this society carry that knowledge. They have carried it for generations. The specific details blur and shift, but the feeling underneath stays constant. The feeling that there is a world inside the world, that some people know the way in, that belonging to the right room changes everything. The secret stays secret because it never had to be spoken. It only had to be felt, and it was. Generation after generation, it was felt and passed on and felt again. But feelings are not always enough to keep a secret safe forever. Sometimes a person gets close, not close close enough to walk through the door, but close enough to press their ear against the stone and hear something, close enough to ask the right question at the wrong moment, close enough to make someone nervous. There have always been outsiders who got too close to skull and bones. Not enemies, not spies, just curious people, journalists, researchers, former students who never got tapped and spent years wondering why. People who noticed patterns that weren't supposed to be noticed. People who started pulling on a single thread and found it connected to something much larger than they expected. Most of them stopped, not because anyone threatened them, not because anything dramatic happened. They stopped because the wall they hit was not made of danger. It was made of silence. And silence, when it is deep enough and old enough, is its own kind of answer. But a few of them didn't stop. In 1876, a group of Yale students broke into the tomb. They called themselves the Order of the File and Claw. They slipped inside during a night when the building sat empty. They moved through the rooms by candlelight, the flame throwing long orange shadows across the walls. They saw what was inside: artifacts, relics, objects that meant something to the men who kept them there. The students wrote about what they found. They published it. They described a room that felt old in a way that had nothing to do with age. A room that felt like it had been waiting. The society did not collapse. It did not scatter. It absorbed the intrusion the way deep water absorbs a stone. The ripple spread. Then the surface went smooth again. That is what outsiders always find. Not a crumbling wall, not a secret that falls apart when touched. They find something that holds, something that has been built to hold. A century later, a journalist named Ron Rosenbaum wrote about the society for a magazine called Esquire. He camped outside the tomb with a tape recorder. He sat in the dark on the grass of the old campus, the night air cool and damp around him. The stone building rising against the sky like something that had always been there and always would be. He recorded sounds, voices, fragments of ritual he could not fully make out. He published what he found. People read it. People talked about it. And the society continued exactly as it had before. Alexandra Robbins went further. She spent years interviewing former members. She published a book in 2002. She named names. She described rituals. She traced connections between members and positions of power in government and finance and intelligence. The book sold. People read it. Conversations started that had never started before. And the society continued exactly as it had before. This is the quiet truth underneath all the noise. The outsiders who got closest did not find a house of cards. They found something that did not need to hide, because it had already made itself part of the furniture, part of the way things work. So ordinary in its presence, so old in its roots. That exposure changed nothing about its function. Think about what that means for a moment. A secret that survives being told is not really a secret anymore. It is something else. It is a fact that people have decided not to act on. It is a truth that sits in plain sight, because the systems built around it are too large and too old to simply dismantle. The outsiders who got too close did not fail because they were wrong. Some of them were very right. They failed, if you can call it that, because rightness alone does not move the kind of weight they were pushing against. There is something almost peaceful about that, if you let yourself sit with it. The people who pressed their ears to the stone and heard something real. The people who wrote it down and sent it out into the world. They did what curious people do. They followed the thread. They told what they found. And the world received it the way the tomb received the order of the file and claw, with a long, slow stillness, with the patience of something that has been standing for a very long time and expects to keep standing. The stone does not argue with the person who touches it. It simply remains, and the door remains locked. And the families who know what is on the other side of that door go, on knowing it in the way they have always known it, not in words, not in documents, in the quiet, steady feeling that some rooms are built for certain people, and that belonging to the right room changes everything. Close your eyes for a moment. Not really. Keep listening, but imagine it. You are standing on the corner of High Street and Grove Street in New Haven, Connecticut. It is late, past midnight maybe, the kind of late where the city has gone quiet but not fully asleep. A few windows still glow amber in the distance. A car passes somewhere 2 blocks over, its headlights sweeping across wet pavement, and then it is gone. The sound fades like a stone dropped into deep water. The air smells like October. Damp leaves, cold stone, a faint trace of wood smoke from somewhere you cannot see. The sky above you is dark blue, not quite black, the way a clear autumn sky gets when the moon has already set and the stars are doing all the work. They are doing it quietly. They always do. You look up the street and you can see the tomb. It sits there the way it has always sat there, heavy and gray and patient. The Egyptian columns rise up from the sidewalk like old teeth. The iron door is shut. It is always shut. No windows catch the light because there is no light to catch. The building gives nothing back. It just stands there, absorbing the dark, the way a stone absorbs heat on a summer afternoon, and holds it long after the sun has gone. You are ordinary, you know that. Most people are. That is not an insult. That is just the math of the world. A few thousand people have walked through that iron door in the last 190 years. A few thousand out of hundreds of millions. The ones inside were not always smarter. They were not always braver. They were not always better. But they were chosen. And being chosen, it turns out, is its own kind of power. Maybe the oldest kind. What does the society think of you standing out here on the sidewalk? The honest answer is probably nothing. Not contempt, not warmth, nothing. You are not part of the calculation. You never were. The men who built this place and the men who filled it across all these generations were not thinking about you when they made their plans. They were thinking about each other, about the room, about the names on the list, and the seats at the table, and the quiet understanding that some things are arranged before they are announced. That is not a ghost story. It is not even a scandal, exactly. It is just how certain kinds of power have always worked. In the dark, in the quiet, among people who already know each other and already trust each other and already share something that cannot be explained to someone who was not in the room. The wind moves through the trees along the street. The leaves are mostly gone by now, and the branches make thin black lines against the sky like cracks in old porcelain. The sidewalk is empty in both directions. The tomb does not move. It does not breathe. It does not need to. You stand there and you feel something. Not fear. Something quieter than fear. The feeling of standing next to a river that has been running longer than you have been alive and will keep running long after you are gone. The river does not know your name. It does not need to. It just moves. It just continues. There is a kind of peace in that, if you let yourself find it. The world is full of things larger than any one person, full of systems and structures and old agreements made in old rooms. Most of us live our whole lives just outside those rooms. We press our ears to the stone sometimes. We hear something. We wonder. And then we go home and make dinner and put the kids to bed and wake up the next morning and do it again. That is not failure. That is just life. The ordinary life. The one most of us are living. The stars above New Haven are the same stars that were there in 1832 when William Huntington Russell and Alphonso Taft sat together and decided to build something that would last. The same stars that watched the tomb go up, stone by stone. The same stars that have hung over every Thursday night, every initiation, every handshake between men who already knew what the handshake meant. They do not care about the tomb either. They are just burning, quietly, at an enormous distance, doing what they have always done. You are standing in the dark outside a locked door. The night is cool and still. The air smells like leaves and cold stone. Somewhere far above you, the stars keep their own counsel, and the tomb remains. There is a symbol you have seen your whole life and never thought twice about. 2 crossed bones beneath a skull. It shows up on poison bottles, on pirate flags, on motorcycle patches and Halloween decorations, and the backs of old medicine cabinets. You have walked past it 1,000 times. You have never stopped to ask where it came from. Why that image? Why those bones? Why the skull looks the way it does, hollow-eyed and patient, like it is waiting for something. The Skull and Bones Society did not invent that symbol, but they made it mean something different, something heavier. They took an old image and filled it with new weight, and now it floats through American culture like a coin that has passed through too many hands to trace back to its origin. is what old institutions do. They leave marks on the world without signing their names. Walk through New Haven on any given afternoon. The light comes down gold through the elm trees. The old stone buildings hold the warmth of it. Students move across the green in small clusters, carrying books, talking quietly. The city feels like a place that has been thinking for a very long time. Like a library that grew walls and streets and a harbor. And somewhere in that city, on High Street, the tomb sits. It does not advertise itself. It does not need to. The building is its own symbol. Thick Egyptian revival stone, dark and smooth. No windows facing the street. A heavy iron door that has not opened for a stranger in nearly 2 centuries. It sits there, the way a period sits at the end of a sentence. Final, certain, done. People who grow up in New Haven develop a particular relationship with that building. They learn to notice it without looking at it directly, the way you learn to navigate a piece of furniture in a dark room. You know it is there. You know its shape. You move around it without thinking. That kind of knowing gets passed down. Parents point it out to children, not always with words. Sometimes just a glance, a slight pause in the step. The children grow up and do the same thing with their own children. And the tomb becomes part of the texture of the place, part of what New Haven is. Some cities have their famous haunted houses, their old battlefields, their strange museums. New Haven has the tomb, and what the tomb represents is not ghosts or violence or tragedy. It represents the quiet, persistent idea that some things are not for everyone, that there are rooms inside rooms inside rooms, that the world has a backside that most people never see. That idea has seeped into the culture, here the way water seeps into old stone. Slowly, completely, without anyone deciding it should. You can feel it in the way Yale students talk about secret societies in general. There are others on campus, smaller ones, less famous ones, but they all exist in the shadow of skull and bones. They all measure themselves against it. The bones set the standard for what a secret society is supposed to be: permanent, selective, serious, unreadable from the outside, and that standard spread outward into American culture, into the way American Americans think about power and secrecy, and the men who hold both. Before Skull and Bones became famous, Americans had a simpler idea about how power worked. You ran for office. People voted. The best man won. It was a clean story, a hopeful one. Skull and Bones complicated that story. It suggested that behind the voting and the running and the winning, there were older arrangements, older loyalties, a different kind of election that happened in a different kind of room. Whether that is true or not, the idea took hold. And once an idea takes hold in a culture, it changes the culture. It becomes part of how people see the world, part of the questions they ask, part of the suspicion they carry quietly in their chests when they watch the news or read about a new cabinet appointment or notice a familiar last name in a headline. The symbol left in plain sight is not just the skull and the crossed bones on the iron door of the tomb. The symbol is the tomb itself. It is the fact that it is still there, still locked, still silent, still full of whatever it has always been full of. It says, there are things you do not know. There are agreements you were not part of. There are rooms you will never enter. And it says this not with words, but with stone, with iron, with a door that does not open. That is a very old kind of power, and it has never gone out of fashion. There is a woman named Carol who grew up 3 blocks from the tomb. She is in her 70s now. She lives in Tucson, Arizona, in a small house with a red tile roof and a yard full of pale gravel and desert sage. The air there smells like dry heat and something faintly sweet, like the earth itself is trying to tell you something. She has lived in Tucson for 40 years, but she still crosses the street when she passes a certain kind of building. She cannot always explain why. It is just something her body remembers. Carol grew up on Prospect Street in New Haven in the 1960s. Her father worked at a machine shop. Her mother took in sewing. They were not Yale people. They were New Haven people, which is a different thing entirely. Yale sat in their city the way a cathedral sits in a small town. You grew up in its shadow. You learned early that it was not yours. She remembers the tomb from childhood the way you remember a scar. Not with fear exactly, with awareness. You knew it was there. You knew it meant something. You just did not know what. Her older brother told her once that men went inside that building and came out different. He was maybe 14 when he said it. He had heard it from someone else, who had heard it from someone else. That is how stories travel in neighborhoods that do not have access to the official version of things. They pass mouth to mouth, block to block, generation to generation. They lose some details and gain others, but the core stays the same. The core is always the same. There are people who belong and people who don't. And the ones who belong go into that building and make arrangements that the rest of us will spend our whole lives living inside of. Carol moved to Arizona in 1984. She followed a man, then stayed after the man left. She built a life in the desert. She raised 2 kids. She worked as a school librarian for 26 years. She is, by any measure, a person who has moved on. But she brought the story with her. She told her kids about the tomb the way other parents tell their kids about the town they grew up in, not as a warning, not as a lesson, just as a fact about the world. There is a building in New Haven, Connecticut. It has no windows. Men go inside, and you never quite know what happens. Some of those men end up running the country. Make of that what you will. Her daughter, who is in her 40s now and lives in Portland, Oregon, tells the same story to her own friends. It has drifted further from New Haven. It has picked up new details, lost old ones. But the feeling at the center of it has not changed. That feeling is something like, the world has a back room, and most of us are not in it. That feeling travels well. It does not need a specific address. It does not need the name of a street or the date of a founding. It just needs the image. A stone building, a locked door, men who know each other in ways that most people never will. Carol visited New Haven once, about 10 years ago. She drove past the tomb on a gray October afternoon. The leaves were down. The sky was the color of old pewter. The building looked exactly as she remembered it. Heavy, silent, indifferent to the people walking past it on the sidewalk. She did not stop the car. She drove around the block once, and then she left. She said later that she did not feel afraid. she felt something more like recognition, like seeing a face you have known your whole life but never actually met. The tomb looked back at her the way it looks back at everyone, without expression, without apology, without any particular interest in being understood. That is the thing about a legend that travels. It does not need the original place to survive. It carries the original place inside it, the way a seed carries the memory of the tree it came from. Carol took New Haven with her to Tucson. Her daughter took it to Portland. Somewhere right now, someone who has never been within 500 miles of Yale is telling someone else about a building with no windows and a door that does not open. The story has escaped the building. It lives in the air now, in the spaces between what we know and what we suspect, in the quiet moment when you read a headline and notice a familiar name and feel something shift just slightly in your chest. Carol still crosses the street sometimes. She does not always know why, but her body remembers. So here is the question that sits at the center of all of this. Not the question of whether the tomb is real. It is real. You can walk past it. You can put your hand on the stone if you want to. Not the question of whether the society exists. It does. It has for nearly 200 years. Not even the question of whether powerful men have passed through its doors and gone on to shape the country. They have. That part is not in dispute. The question is simpler than all of that, and harder. The question is this: what would have to be true for none of it to matter? Think about what you would need to believe. You would need to believe that 15 young men can share rituals, share secrets, share a room where they say things they have never said out loud before, and then walk out into the world and feel nothing particular toward each other. You would need to believe that bonds formed in the dark, in a building with no windows, over years of careful selection and careful silence, dissolve the moment those men put on suits and take their seats in government. You would need to believe that loyalty has an expiration date. That brotherhood is a word people use and then forget. You would need to believe that coincidence is patient enough to explain all of it. The same families, generation after generation. The same names on the same committees. The same handshakes same rooms, the same quiet phone calls before the public announcements. You would need to believe that all of this is random, that it is the natural result of talented people finding each other, that the world is simply small at the top, and proximity does not mean coordination, and coordination does not mean intention. Maybe that is true. There are serious people who believe it, historians who have spent their careers studying power and influence, and who will tell you calmly, over coffee, that secret societies are less about control and more about comfort, that men who feel the weight of the world on their shoulders want a room where they can take it off for a few hours, that the rituals are theater, that the oaths are tradition, that the whole thing is closer to a very exclusive alumni club than a shadow government. And they might be right. But here is the thing about that explanation. It does not actually close the door. It just moves the question to a different room. Because even if the rituals are theater, the relationships are real. Even if the oaths are tradition, the trust they build is real. Even if no one in that tomb ever said the words, "We will run this country," the men who came out of it ran the country anyway, and they knew each other, and they helped each other, and the doors that opened for them did not open quite so easily for anyone else. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how the world has always worked. That is what makes it harder to dismiss and harder to prove. It lives in the space between the illegal and the invisible, between what you can document and what you can only feel, the way Carol felt it, standing on that sidewalk in the cold New Haven air, looking at a building that looked back at her without explaining itself. The open door in this story is not a door in the tomb. The tomb's door is locked. It has always been locked. The open door is the one in your own thinking, the one that swings on the hinge between what you know and what you suspect, between the world as it is explained to you and the world as it sometimes feels when you are paying attention. Every generation finds this story. Every generation walks up to it the same way. They read the names. They count the coincidences. They sit with the question for a while, and then they make a choice about what kind of world they think they live in. Some of them decide the world is random and vast, and that no group of men, however connected, however loyal, could truly bend it to their will. Some of them decide otherwise. Most of them, if they are honest, decide something in between. They decide that the truth is probably quieter than the legend and probably stranger than the official story, that it lives somewhere in the middle, in the gray space where most real things live. The tomb does not care which conclusion you reach. It has never cared. It was built to keep its secrets, and it has kept them, and it will keep them long after every person who ever walked through that door is gone. The door is still locked. The question is still open. And somewhere tonight, someone is walking past that building for the very first time. That person keeps walking. Their breath makes small clouds in the cold air. They look up at the stone face of the building, at the blank walls and the sealed windows, at the heavy door that has not opened for them and never will. They slow down for just a moment. Then they keep going, and the tomb stays where it is, the way it always has, patient and still and completely indifferent to being seen. That is how this story ends every time. Not with an answer, with a building, with a locked door and a quiet street and the sound of footsteps fading into the dark. You have been sitting with this story for a long time now. The fire has burned low. The night has gone deep and soft around the edges. The questions are still there, but they have settled some. They have found their shape. That is what a good mystery does. It does not leave you frantic. It leaves you thoughtful. It leaves you with something to carry, something small and smooth like a stone in your pocket, something you can turn over in your hand when the world feels like it needs explaining. The Skull and Bones Society has been part of American life for nearly 200 years. The names that passed through that building read like a list of the country itself. Senators and generals, bankers and spies, two men who stood on the same debate stage, and both carried the same secret in their chest. A father and a son, both presidents, both initiated in that same stone room, both bound by the same oath they never fully described to anyone outside. You can look at all of that and see coincidence. The world is large. Yale is old. Powerful families send their children to powerful schools, and powerful schools produce powerful people. That is not a mystery. is just how things have always worked. Or you can look at all of that and see something else. A thread, a quiet, persistent thread that runs through the fabric of American power, like a seam you only notice once you know to look for it. Not a grand design, not a single hand moving all the pieces, something subtler than that. A shared language, a shared loyalty, a room where certain men learned to trust each other above everyone else, and then spent the rest of their lives acting on that trust in ways that shaped the country around them. Neither answer is complete. Both answers are probably a little bit true. That is the nature of this kind of story. It does not resolve. It accumulates. Every decade adds another name, another connection, another moment where the same small circle seems to appear at the center of something enormous. And every decade, a new group of people finds the story and starts asking the same questions the last group asked. The story keeps going because the building keeps standing, because the door stays locked, because the names keep appearing. Right now, the tomb is quiet. The street outside is empty. New Haven is sleeping, or close to it. The old stone walls are dark under a sky full of cold stars, and the building looks the way very old things look when no one is watching them. Settled, permanent, like it grew out of the ground instead of being built on top of it. The ivy on the walls is still. The iron door is shut. Whatever is inside the way it has always been, held in the dark and the silence and the weight of all that stone. There is something almost peaceful about it if you let yourself feel it that way. A place that has kept its word. A secret that has held its shape across generations. Whatever you think about the men who built it and the men who followed them, the building itself is just a building now, standing in the dark, doing what buildings do, waiting, enduring, outlasting everyone who ever cared about it. The fire is nearly out. The last of the light is just a soft orange glow, barely enough to see by. The night is full and quiet and easy. You know the story now. You know the names and the dates and the shape of the question. You know where the tomb sits and what it looks like and why people slow down when they walk past it. You know as much as anyone outside that door has ever known. The rest is behind the locked door, and the door is still locked. maybe that is exactly where it belongs. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night. One tap, and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep